All right. GameSound live. All right. Cool. All right. Hello. Nice to see everyone. I'm Patrick. I'm a composer here in Los Angeles. Thanks to y'all for coming out to my session. I'm going to talk about procedural music today and how to think about composing using procedural techniques. This is a world that's like all of a sudden super accessible and exciting. I'm sure everyone here is fascinated by the possibilities, if maybe a little suspicious about the whole thing. The talk is structured as follows. I'll start with a brief overview of what procedural music is and our preconceived notions about what it sounds like. Then I'll go over 3 example projects, 2 briefly and 1 more in depth. The projects were all created in Unreal Engine with MetaSounds, but I'll speak more broadly about procedural music as well. Quickly, a little bit about myself. This is my first GameSoundCon. Happy to be here. And I'm also quite new to the game world in general. Historically, I've composed music for film and TV and commercials. I've created compositions and art pieces that have been performed in a bunch of neat places, and I've also worked as a graphic and motion designer. More recently, I've been exploring the intersection of procedural music, art, composition, and games, which led me to Unreal Engine and MetaSounds. I've been posting some of my explorations and demos on Twitter under the name Tapes Club. So let's get started with some basic definitions. What is procedural music? It is music that is created by a system or a set of logical instructions, and it is generated in real time. Now, this is true, technically, but it's also probably making your eyes glaze over. And I'm pretty sure that you can hear what this music sounds like in your head, and you don't like it. It is boring. It sounds like robot music. And it doesn't sound like a composer was involved at all. Now, as I hinted at earlier, these are more like our preconceived notions about procedural music. So, of course, we have some positive preconceived ideas of it too, or else you wouldn't be here listening to this talk. It's responsive. In games, for example, music can respond to your player or the environment, to branching story decisions, to day-night cycles. It's detailed. You can go way beyond what we think of as like adaptive music and use just the tiniest minutia for inputs for your music. And you can make tons of it. You can have infinite music for infinite possibilities. But what does it matter if the music sounds like this, like boring, robotic, etc.? So let's expand your idea of procedural music. But first, I want to make sure we're all on the same page and listen to a very simple procedural music example. So this is MetaSounds, but no worries, it's very simple and I'll explain everything. We are just going to start a metronome, basically, and every beat we're going to pick a random number. We'll convert that to a frequency, and that'll be the pitch that goes into this sine oscillator. Connect the sine oscillator to the output with an envelope, and we're done. So let's take a listen. This will sound familiar. All right. So we did it. We created some procedural music, and it's all of these things. It's boring, robotic, etc. So let's try another example. This is a very simple human procedural example. We don't even need MetaSounds. We don't even need a computer, but it's still procedural. The way our system works is we'll play our first chord. It's a sick chord. So, okay, yeah, playing our chord. And then we'll conduct a vibe check. And if the vibe is good, we'll play a cool chord. If the vibe is bad, we'll play a sad chord. And then we'll repeat. So there's no math here or anything like that, but we're still following a logic system that adapts to our situation. Right now it's very simplistic, sure, but we can add more layers of complexity. Like here, if the vibe is bad, before we repeat, we will host a seance. It's October, we have to take these things seriously. And if the spirits respond, we'll play a spooky chord. If they don't respond, we're good, we'll just repeat as normal. So now we've built a responsive music system, no math or computers or anything like that. It's just a set of rules based on vibe and spirits. So these are extreme examples, right? Obviously. Total random on one hand, controversial, and vibe and spirits on the other hand. But the point is, there's a huge world to explore between these two extremes, right? So with that in mind, I want to challenge everyone to adopt a new perspective on procedural music. So first, we need to keep in mind our objective and our criteria for success. The objective is to make a system that generates music. The criteria for success is to make the music sound interesting to humans. You might have other criteria for success in your situation, but I don't care. We are just going to look at this one. So a system that makes music, that's easy, right? We just made that random number thing in like 2 seconds. Making it sound interesting to humans, how do we do that? So I'm going to touch on a detail first before we get to the big picture. And these are the two things, detail, big picture, that I really want you to keep in mind during this talk. The detail is something that I think trips up a lot of procedural music, and I want to emphasize that first as randomness. Important thing number one. And this is a good opportunity to read a quote that I love by Laurie Spiegel. Randomness has been getting used a lot for music, partly because it's easier to program into a computer than well thought through rules and procedures based on the study of real music. But a musician's mind does not work randomly when creating. So I love this quote, not only because it's from 1989, but because it gets at an important truth. People don't like random stuff. We listen to music that has hooks and choruses that repeat. We like chords and chord progressions that incorporate frequency relationships that our ears respond to. We don't like streams of random numbers, even if computers make them really easy to spit out. However, on the flip side, we like things that are new and fresh. And although random kind of has like a negative connotation in music, we do use words with a positive connotation that kind of mean random, like spontaneous, unexpected, surprising, unpredictable, inspired. So how do we create music that isn't random but isn't formulaic? How do we create this like good random? How can we use randomness not just because it's easy, but because it helps make our procedural music sound interesting to humans? So that brings us to the big picture that we'll discuss for the rest of the talk. The big picture answer to this question, and the key to making our procedural music interesting to humans, is composing. Important thing number two. So to address another common misconception with procedural music is it's really not the computer composing for you. More accurately, it's you, a human person, composing under a different paradigm. It's just another way to compose. And you still have to do all the things a composer does. Express yourself, evoke emotions, satisfy the demands of performers, which I promise is relevant, and we will get to that. Just make something that's worth listening to. So what I'll do now is go through a few example projects and talk about like the composer decisions that went into them. They're all different kind of like simple projects, and I think it'll be useful to illustrate these ideas by looking at kind of what worked and what didn't, and the decisions behind them. So, project number one. This is like a quick sketch. I wanted to create this kind of ethereal, evolving composition around a simple arpeggiated figure, and I wanted it to feel a little bit like an ensemble with several players performing together. I'll start by playing about a minute of the piece, and this is entirely procedurally generated and entirely synthesized in-engine in real time. I'll mention again up front that I'm going to breeze pretty quickly through this project and the next project, and I'll spend a little more time on the final project. So we'll get to some confusing details, but for now, let's stay zoomed out on the big picture. So what are we working with here? We have 3 instruments that are playing repeating patterns of either 2, 3, or 4 notes. That's like the main sound. There's also 2 swell instruments that play this kind of cloud of faster notes that swells in and out. And then there's the bass. So one thing I really want to highlight here is the idea that this feels like an ensemble performing together. Because if you're treating this like you're composing for an ensemble, then you're composing. You're establishing limitations that guide your creative output, and you're thinking about what makes sense for the group of instruments and performers that you have available, even if it's just an ensemble of synthesizers. So let's look at how the form is set up. Our 3 pattern instruments change to a new section at a random time. So to the listener, this feels unpredictable. However, the swell instruments always swell in and out over the duration of one section. The section changes can be either an evolution of the pattern in the same key, which feels like it's just kind of drifting a little bit, or it can be a major key change, which also triggers the bass, and this feels like more of an event. So although the section lengths are indeterminate, the 3 instrument groups make their changes in relation to each other, which feels cohesive. So this is actually set up to mimic a real-world situation where you can imagine like a few performers on stage, and they're repeating some pattern, and it goes on until everyone's ready, and then they like make eye contact, and together cue the next section. So it's really just trying to identify this sort of like human element and bring it in here. So back to the big picture, what are the composition decisions that went into this, and what makes this interesting or not to a human? So on the plus side, the arpeggios approximate piano playing. The ascending arpeggio figure is idiomatic for a keyboard instrument, and I constrained the range between the intervals, so these figures should end up in a comfortable range for human hands. So you could like imagine humans playing this on a keyboard. There are non-grid rhythms for more natural gestures. So these like swells in and out, just feels a little bit more natural. And the different instruments change sections together at the same time, which approximates ensemble playing. It's just like what we talked about before, 3 people kind of cueing each other for each section. On the minus side, the grid rhythms are very locked. I could like introduce some natural sort of humanization to the timing, little inaccuracies. The harmonic changes are sometimes unnatural. What I did here was like limit the range of keys and tonalities. But otherwise, the movement is random, and some of the changes just like don't really sound good. So I could create a set of rules for the harmonic progression that would be a little bit more intelligent, I guess. And there's no dynamics within the figures. I think adding accent notes to the figures and like group dynamics, like quiet or loud sections, would probably go a long way. So, in contrast with the first example, which was entirely synthesized, this next example mixes both pre-recorded live instruments with elements that are synthesized in real time. So what I wanted to do was see if I could create the feeling of like a band sort of jamming on this psych-rock groove. So recorded a bunch of stuff at the studio and tried to set up a system where the material is assembled procedurally in a way that feels kind of like what a band would arrive at naturally in like a jam situation. So again, it's this idea of trying to replicate the decisions that a live ensemble would make when they're coming up with a form on the fly. There is one interactive element, which is that you can press F to transition in and out of, I guess, the F section. And this happens at about 45 seconds in, which I'll play for you, this video. All right, so let's look at the instrumental elements in this piece. I recorded live piano, drums, and guitar, and the bass and synths are generated procedurally and synthesized in Unreal. The drums drive the form, so each loop ends with a fill, and that cues the next loop. So the drums are sort of this continuous string of loops, and this triggers all the other instruments to do something, like when a new loop starts. Otherwise, it's not really anything super clever. It's just kind of like this elaborate series of gates and probabilities so that the audio files are triggered in this like human way that I talked about. I'll play some of the different piano recordings to give an idea of like the variety in the recorded material. Conventions. Cool. So I'll also show you some of the synth patches. And what I did here was just like grab a few patches from other projects that each of which could kind of generate like a flourish of notes from one trigger and just like kind of threw it in without really thinking about it that much. Cool. So back to the big picture. What is making this interesting to a human or not? The pre-recorded audio is literally human, me, a human, all of my cool human mistakes encoded in these audio files. The audio loops are different lengths, so there's a lot of variation in how things line up. The beginnings and endings of all the audio files are quantized to eighth notes, so it still makes sense in a musical context, but they can like line up in all kinds of different ways. The different instruments accent or change at the same time, approximating ensemble performances. This is what we talked about a couple of times. And the random elements are in a support role covered by the composed elements. So what I mean here is there can be some material that sounds pretty random in isolation, in like the synths and the bass, but because it's always coupled with more traditionally composed melodies in the piano, it kind of just like conceals the randomness. On the con side, the recording the audio was a lot of work. And this is not too bad. I have like, I think if you added all that up, it's like about 200 audio files in total, which is like, works pretty well to listen. You can listen to this for a while and you don't really hear repeats. But like if you wanted to add a couple more sections or a couple more instruments, you could kind of imagine it like ballooning a little bit. Limited to melodies recorded in piano, like obviously you can't really change the pre-recorded audio on the fly, so you can't just like add a new piano melody, really. Not enough drums, you can recognize the loops. This is kind of like an oversight for this particular project. I think more shorter loops would have been better than fewer longer loops. Like you do sort of hear some repeat drums, those human mistakes. And the varying lengths can make things feel a little aimless. I think like this node time signature thing with things lining up at different places like works pretty well, but I could probably add some more rules to tighten things up and make it feel a little bit less like a lazy jam band. So, okay. The last example that I have today is a small interactive minimalist music prototype. And unlike the first two demos, when you run this project, there's no sound, and that's because everything is controlled by the player with a controller. So I'll play a video first. I did post. I posted a build of this at this webpage, tapesclub.itch.io. So you can download it and screw around with it. It's free. So, as promised, I'm going to dive a little deeper on this one, but I'll still highlight some big picture composing concepts as we go. But we will get into some MetaSounds. So, foundation of the piece are these repeating patterns, which I'm calling cells, and you can turn them on and off. They repeat, and they're slightly different lengths, so they create this dense counterpoint with kind of interesting polyrhythms when layered together. So borrowing a couple of layering techniques here, the dense counterpoint is very typical of, unsurprisingly, Steve Reich, and the polyrhythmic layering of patterns of different lengths is very typical of Meshuggah. I bring this up because it can be helpful to listen to music and think, like, how can I replicate this procedurally? And some music, like these two artists, lends itself super well to proceduralism, and you can just like borrow their concepts. So let's look at how this is set up in the patch. Each repeating pattern is contained in this patch called cell. The patch sends MIDI note values, not really, but technically, sort of, kind of, MIDI values and note triggers as outputs, and you can plug this into any sound generator. On the input side, there is an on-off Boolean, turns it on and off, and a reset trigger, which resets the pattern. And at the bottom, you see triggers for a new random pattern, and then start just like kind of starts the metronome. The cell length sets the length or time signature of each cell, and number of notes is how many notes are in each cell as opposed to rests. So let's listen so you can kind of understand what that means. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 notes in the pattern. Group of 4, group of 4, group of 3. So 11 beats in each measure. And you can see down there towards the bottom, the division is 16. So it's 11/16. Yeah, each measure, 11/16 does. Like that. Note min, moving on, note min is 60. It's like middle C. Note max is 100, 3 octaves and a little bit above that. So that's the range that the notes will fall in. The root note is the key, and scale degrees is our tonality, which is just like Lydian. It's only Lydian. Real talk. It's just Lydian because it's fun. It's wacky. Lydian's tight. And lastly, our BPM is 88. So for these settings of the cell, we have repeating bars of 11/16. There are 4 notes and 7 rests in each pattern. We have a set key and a tonality and a range of where the notes will fall. So let's look inside the patch and see how we get there. Here's a patch. And I think it's best if we start at the end, actually, and go backwards. So let's look at the output panel. And moving from right to left, you see the MIDI out. That's where the notes go out. And the MIDI note quantizer, locks notes into our key and tonality, Lydian. But then you might be surprised to see that it's being fed with a random float generator. How do we get repeating patterns out of this random node? If you saw Aaron's talk earlier, you'll know the answer. And it is the current seed variable. So this random node spits out just a random string of numbers, right? But if you give it a seed of like 10, then it'll just spit out that one specific string of random numbers. So if we take the first 4 numbers that it generates and then reset the node, you see on the left, there's a reset variable going into the reset node, or reset input, then it starts over with the same 4 numbers. So then if we change the seed like to 11 or whatever, it'll be a new string of random numbers, and we repeat the first 4 numbers from that seed to form a new pattern. So this is an example, right, of like the good random. We can randomly generate as many patterns as you want for as long as you are interested, but we're actually making patterns out of the random numbers. We're not just like opening the fire hose out of this random float generator. So back to the patch, let's take a look at where the reset comes from. This is pretty simple. There's the trigger repeat in the center, which generates the pulse, in our case, on every 16th note, remember. And then we have a counter that counts up pulses to our cell length input, which is 11, and then calls reset. So in this example, cell length of 11 counts 11 16th notes and then triggers reset. And we start this string of random numbers over again, and the pattern repeats. So we have our pulses, and how do we decide which pulses trigger notes? So remember, we manually set a number of notes input, which in our case was 4 notes. So we want 4 notes to play every time we repeat. So here, our pulse, which is on the left, up on the top, is feeding into a trigger sequence, and we know that the reset variable underneath is going to reset the sequence every 11 pulses, so that's how we get our bar length. And very quickly, you might be like, why don't I have a trigger sequence 16? And this is a neat thing about MetaSounds. It's super easy to just build your own little patch. I'll show you real quick. It's all nodes, no C++, and then it just shows up alongside all the other stock patches. So you just type trigger sequence, and there it is. So it's super handy to just like build out your own library. Anyways, after the sequence, what's going on? The route nodes are just pushing everything into that trigger compare. And there, every note, we're comparing an integer to our number of notes. And if it's less than or equal, we pass through the trigger. So if number of notes is 4, integer is 5, it won't go through. If the integer is 3, it will. Then we do one last check at the bottom to make sure the sequence is turned on, and then we send it to the output. So where does the integer come from? And this is another use of seeded random number generators. So what I did here in the center, there's an array, indices of integers from 1 to 16, that's all it is. And we take a subset that matches the number of notes. So in this case, 11 notes, get an array of integers 1 through 11. Then on the right, I'm randomly getting a new integer with every pulse, and this is what I'm comparing against the number of notes. So obviously, there are 4 numbers in the set of 1 through 11 that are less than or equal to 4. So these, 1, 2, 3, 4, pass through the triggers, and the other numbers won't. And because the random get has a specified seed, when we reset, it plays the same pattern over again. So this gives the notes their timing, and the random float from before gives the notes the pitch. So put all this together, and we have flexible repeating patterns that we can change just by changing the seed. There's one last little bit in the patch that we haven't looked at yet that I'll show you real quick. And that is sometimes the patterns have extra fast notes. And basically, there's like a 15% chance that one pulse in the cell will trigger 4 super fast notes, which is like totally not at all necessary, but makes things a little more unpredictable, which is one of our good random words, right? And just a little bit more like fun. So this patch is how the 4 main patterns plus the percussion patterns are generated. So let's take a quick listen to what we've looked at so far. So quickly, I want to talk about the synthesis methods. I'm not going to go too in-depth, but the basic concepts maybe will still be helpful here. So 2 of the cells are using this very simple sampler I built, which is just like the most like trash version of Contact. You can load in 5 samples, and it splits them up. And the other 2 are using this polyphonic FM synth that I made. It's super easy in MetaSounds to build a pretty complex patch just by starting small and then connecting patches together. So the FM synth starts out with a stereo voice patch, which is just like a monophonic synth with only oscillators and a volume envelope. And then I connect 2 of these together with frequency modulation to make a stereo FM voice patch. And then combine 8 of these with like another simple voice routing patch to make an 8-voice polyphonic synth. So it's nice to build these things out yourself because they can do just exactly what you want. For example, like these don't have per voice filters because I just didn't really need them. But I did build in some extra controls for making like stupid FM noise because I did feel like I needed that. So it's super easy to take like these small pieces and quickly make purpose-built synths for like whatever your situation is. Finally, let's take a look at the analog stick effects, which are super straightforward, but also really fun. Basically got them set up as like two XY pads. And the right stick updates two float parameters on the MetaSound, pitch shift and mess. Pitch shift is what you might imagine, just adjusts the pitch for all the instruments. And then mess like fades in a ring mod, which just has like a sine oscillator like blasting into the main mix. And the negative x-axis also bit crushes the mix. So it's like, so it's cool. The left stick actually doesn't touch the MetaSound at all. It is just fading up the mix and changing some parameters on two submix effects, a reverb and a delay. So this is like real simple, but one thing I did that I thought was pretty effective was to change the parameters of each effect based on the axis being positive or negative, like so. So this way it really feels like 4 separate effects in each direction, and I'm only using 2 effects. Here's a quick demo of the analog sticks. So the last thing that I'll mention is this pause sound effect, which I actually don't think I've played yet. And this is like a super handy little thing. When you pause the game, it plays this little melody. It's a little different every time, but it always follows this like overall upward contour, and it's always in the same key as everything else. So let's take a quick listen. So, I'll accept. I'm in direct competition with that room on applause, so keep it up. So I don't have time to go in depth on this patch, but I just want to show you like how simple it is. So when I hit play, I generate the sequence of notes in that alternating gesture patch, and I send those notes to the polyphonic synth that we looked at. When the melody ends, it calls on finished, and the patch stops taking up resources. I can customize the intervals, speed, number of notes in the alternating gesture, and then of course the sound to whatever I want in the synth. So it's more interesting than like a single pause sound effect, and obviously easier and more flexible than manually creating like a million similar melodies. I just wanted to point this out because I think this kind of like supplementary musical flourish is kind of the most obvious starting point for incorporating procedural music into a game, especially if you have like pre-existing content. Cool, so let's go through the pros and cons for this project. On the pro side, it is interactive and the player has agency in creating the music. And the controls are reactive and satisfying. So this takes us back to a point I made right at the very beginning about the relationship between a composer and a performer. And the performer here is like the player, right? So, and one thing we do as composers is we make sure the performer is satisfied playing our music on their instrument. Their instrument, of course, in this case, is the controller. You want to empower a performer to use their skills in a way that feels good. And I think there's like obvious parallels here with the relationship between a composer and a performer and the relationship between a game designer and a player, which is like a big topic that I'm not going to go into more, but I think it's super interesting and like worth keeping in mind as you're working on stuff. Back to our pros, it is a good use case for repetitive rhythms, mimics an established style, minimalism, so it doesn't like feel out of place. Plus, there are some non-grid melodies that feel more human, obviously along with like any human controlled effects, it's going to feel human. On the negative side, the individual cells in isolation can feel a little like computery and inhuman. That could probably use like some humanization, but benefits from the dense counterpoint. Serious button mashing can get a little chaotic. I didn't demonstrate that, but trust me. We give some responsibility here, right, to the player, and some people are going to abuse it. And there's also just there's like a tension, right, between making it always sound good and then having the risk that it might not, but that can kind of, in turn, make it more exciting when the player plays something that's like really cool. So, tension. And finally, we're locked into a specific style. You could add like new sections and take it to different places, but this, I don't know, could introduce new problems like making the controls too complicated. No, it's a small prototype. I didn't have to think about that stuff. A quick wrap up. A few things here to keep in mind. Those are my 3 projects. Composing. Do it. We all know, right, there's no one way to compose, and you probably work completely differently from me, so you don't have to compose the way I do, but please do try to actually compose when you're making procedural music. Randomness. Use it for good, not evil. Resist the temptation of the random number generator, and if you put one in, ask yourself, like, did this make the music sound better, or did it just make more music? And think about humans. For now, at least, your audience is humans. So you may want to consider making your music sound good to them. And I would leave you, with a couple of resources that have helped me, in case you want to dig into this further. First, and these are fresh resources, there were some great talks in this room about MetaSounds and procedural music. Aaron gave a talk earlier today that was like this talk, but by the guy that made the tools. So it's great. I feel like they're actually very complimentary, and if you missed it, you should absolutely check it out. It's a great place to start, especially if you haven't used MetaSounds. Also, Stefan, if you so I didn't talk about the visuals in this at all. These are just me trying to also experiment with the visual parts of Unreal Engine. But Stefan, who's a tech artist, did this talk earlier today where he's actually knows what's up, and he walked through making a Niagara system that's reactive, which was super cool. And all the other talks too have been a lot of fun. Beyond that, there's a terminology note I want to make real fast. You might have seen all these terms, procedural, algorithmic, generative, and wondered what's the difference between these? And the short answer is they're basically interchangeable. There might be some semantic differences, whatever, but you can just you can search for any of these terms, and the information are going to be relevant. I use procedural music for this talk because I think it's more widely used in games. Algorithmic music I think is more common in academia, and generative music is Brian Eno's term. So the point though is there's great resources that you'll miss if you only search for one term. And then 2 other really good resources is Laurie Spiegel, who wrote that randomness quote that I read, has several dozen essays online that are all super interesting. And unfortunately, it's I can only find it on the Internet Archive. But I promise you, if you type in that pretty awkward URL with multiple slashes in weird places into the Internet Archive, I'll try to share a link online or something. It's super good, and there's super cool stuff. And then the Oxford Handbook of Algorithmic Music is also a collection of essays that's super interesting. There's a video game specific one by David Kanega that's really cool, and a big range of stuff that's super good. Cool? Everybody good? Yeah. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.